The ACCC has in front of it a litany of concerns and complaints by vegetable growers, and it will no doubt develop them, say more about them. So we'll watch that space.
Welcome back to the Vegalogue podcast, a dialogue about the Australian vegetable industry from AUSVEG. I'm Alex Lashchuk. The Australian supermarket sector is under significant examination, with government reviews focusing on market competition, pricing practices, and consumer protection. These reviews also address concerns about the dominance of major supermarket chains and seek to ensure, among other things, fair treatment of suppliers and a more sustainable and equitable supply chain. Professor Allan Fels AO is a prominent figure in Australian competition law and consumer advocacy, who has also served as the chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. He recently joined AUSVEG to give his informed views on the recent flurry of attention on the big supermarkets and the major developments of 2024. Join us as we explore the complexities and challenges involved in addressing the current state of Australia's supermarket sector. Good afternoon, Allan. It is an honour to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Over the last 12 months, there has been a strong focus on the Australian supermarket sector. These reviews and inquiries build on the 2020 ACCC Perishable Agricultural Goods Inquiry, which, to be honest, we have seen little, if any, improvement in the trading relationship between retailers and growers. Over the years, there have also been lots of attempts and different inquiries and investigations to try and address various issues in Australia's supermarket sector, including the ACCC's last comprehensive report back in 2008. Do you see anything different contextually in this latest round of attention, and what hopes do you have that meaningful improvements for consumers and suppliers will be achieved?
So let's spend a minute on the history. In the last 25 years, at least, there have been many concerns, complaints, and justifiable complaints from vegetable growers and others about their treatment at the hands of big retailers. Now, in response to that, until very recently, there was just a tokenistic response. There's the odd inquiry. Voluntary codes of conduct were set up in respect of some products, particularly, I think, horticultural, and nothing much happened. With voluntary codes, our participants, including the big supermarkets, don't have to participate, and they're not legally bound by any decisions, and typically they don't join unless the conditions remain anodyne. The 2008 ACCC report also went quite soft on this matter. The whole 2008 report was a little bit too friendly to the big supermarkets, and strangely had a big attack on Metcash, which, whatever you say about it, is not a major player in the product market competition end of the spectrum. It tends to be a follow-up of what happens with the big supermarkets. And then there have been inquiries and all this sort of thing. But you are correct in your question to imply that right up until now, very little has been done to address the many concerns. There is a fairly good statement of concerns in the recent ACCC reports, but until now, little action.
Two of the major developments that have flowed from 2024's attention on the supermarkets have been the Emerson report into the Food and Grocery Code, as well as the ACCC Supermarkets Inquiry, which has released its interim report ahead of the final report due early next year. What are your views on the Emerson report? Has it gone far enough? And what meaningful outcomes would you like to see come out of the ACCC inquiry?
It seems that the Emerson report's being adopted in full, so I'll assume that. The report is definitely a big step forward because it proposes and sort of ensures that the code will be compulsory. The big supermarkets will have to join it. There will be sanctions. They can be enforced legally. I'm pretty sure by the ACCC, amongst others, which is a powerful enforcement body and takes its job seriously. So that's a good step. I believe it will have some positive effects. The code and codes generally tend to focus on issues of process. Has there been a fair and appropriate process? For example, have contracts been terminated without sufficient notice or in unfair circumstances and so on? So some of the alleged kind of unfair, gross behaviour, etc., under the code will be cut back on. I'm fairly sure that at the level of process and to a degree at the level of unfair treatment, that the code will have an impact. But also, just note an important qualification. I don't think the code will be about prices. If growers think they're getting an unfair price, too low or whatever, in general, I do not think it's at all likely that the code will address that matter. It may have the effect of getting rid of some inequities. It may make certain matters a bit more transparent. Things of that sort. That's a step forward. Perhaps not enough for growers, but it's some progress, and I'm sure they will want yet more once we've seen how the code goes. But for the moment, I would say for the next few years, we have to see how the code works. And then bearing in mind that the same thing was said when the voluntary code was brought in, we'll see how it goes. We waited something like 15 years or more. There were some critical reports and so on about the code, but nothing happened. So I would suggest we need a review of the new code in 5 years. Now, regarding the ACCC, it's more about the product market. And indeed, I just want to comment that claims that the code will improve outcomes for consumers, I don't accept. I don't think the code will have any significant adverse effects on consumers. I mean, if growers get a slightly better deal, that won't affect consumers. And indeed, you may get slight improvements and efficiencies in vegetable growing just because they're treated in a more sensible, rational fashion. So for the consumer, from the ACCC point of view, there is something in that report. But let me go back to the ACCC and the code and supply side. Well, in its interim report, it has acknowledged the many concerns of growers, the concerns that were similar to those that the Emerson report heard about. I just don't know what will happen, but my guess is that the ACCC's comments on the supply side will largely be saying, we've got a compulsory code, let's see what happens under it. Just arguing against that for a moment, it's also notable that the ACCC has conducted some litigation itself on the supply side. In my time, we took on then Safeway as part of Woolworths over poor treatment in respect of suppliers, and we won. And then in the time of Rod Sims, he had a much bigger victory over unconscionable conduct. There was a victory over Coles. Coles, who have expert advisors, decided not to fight the case. All the evidence was put in front of a federal judge, and she strongly endorsed the findings of unconscionable conduct. It's a fact, however, that Woolies fought the case and actually won it, which slightly undermines the ACCC achievement. But on the whole, the question of unconscionable conduct has made some progress as a result of that. And I am sure the ACCC would be looking for any examples of unconscionable conduct that it could litigate, irrespective of the code. So we should watch that space in case anything happens there. The ACCC has in front of it a litany of concerns and complaints by vegetable growers, and it will no doubt develop them, say more about them. Whether it triggers litigation, I'm not sure. To trigger litigation, you have to prove an actual breach of part of the competition, or especially unconscionable conduct. And they're not easy cases to win. So, again, we'll watch that space. On the product market side, there's a number of things the ACCC can look at. My big picture is that there will not be dramatic developments in Australia in competition in grocery supermarkets unless there is a major new entrant. We now know that Kaufmann's, quite a big German supplier, seriously considered getting into the Australian market. That would have made a difference, but they pulled out. We're not quite sure why. Their stated reason is credible enough, I guess, that something big happened to them in Europe and they decided to put their effort into it. Whether on top of that they found the Australian environment not encouraging, I do not know. But without a big player coming in, no radical change. And incidentally, if a big new player comes in, I can't predict the effect on growers. I'm just agnostic about that point. On the product market side, the ACCC could usefully probe a few things like land banking, which is the big supermarkets buying land which might otherwise be bought by new entrants or other players. And there's a few other things the ACCC may do at the margin.
One of the key issues for fresh produce is the asymmetrical data flow between suppliers and a retailer. For instance, in the weekly price tendering process for a product like, say, broccoli, Coles or Woolworths have a complete picture on quantity, quality, consumer demand, market conditions, and the prices all the growers are quoting, and yet the supplier has no insights to that data. How can we improve the visibility of pricing whilst still maintaining market competition?
So I agree there is other things being equal and inequality in bargaining power in that situation. I have no highly specific answer, but I think it would be useful if the code looked at that. It's now got more opportunities to do that. And if the ACCC also had a look in its report, in some agricultural areas, growers are allowed to cooperate on exchanges of price information cooperation which might otherwise tickle the competition law prohibitions on agreements on prices. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, but maybe they could get an authorisation if someone had a good view on that. So, yes, I can imagine something might be done about that. Somehow my gut feeling is that something may be done, but it's not going to be enough to eradicate the imbalance, and also that the supermarkets will be making claims about confidentiality and their difficulty in getting good prices if they have to share it.
Access to food is a basic human right, and yet we have two of the largest supermarkets as publicly listed companies as the major conduit to feed Australians, but who are obliged to maximise their returns to shareholders. Is this relationship at counter purposes, and how can it be rebalanced?
It can only be rebalanced significantly if there's greater competition. As I've said, if we got a new player in, that would make a difference. If we don't, there's still a few little things we can do at the margin. But the key problem is that we have essentially a cosy duopoly in food supply. LD makes a bit of a difference at the margin. Having IGA is better than not having IGA, etc., etc. But the key concern that you raise about, if I can retranslate it, the right of Australians to get food at the best possible prices, that concern is somewhat compromised by the lack of competition in big retail groceries.
Globally, there are inquiries into supermarket retailers and also inquiries into the financial sustainability of fresh produce suppliers. Are there any supermarket supply chains globally that you think are working effectively, that is in the best interests of suppliers, consumers and retailers?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any. Regarding consumers, I do think that in the UK, just having 4 big players and more on the fringe gets a better outcome for consumers. The profit margins are less, the markups are less, the net profit after tax is less, and the same is true in some, at least, big US retail grocery markets. Regarding growers, I just don't know, and I don't know whether having more competitive product markets in the UK, the US or elsewhere, whether that has a good or a bad effect on small suppliers.
Thank you, Allan, for your insights into the Australian supermarket sector and the relationship between suppliers and retailers.
Good, pleasure. Thank you for coming.
You've been listening to the Vegalogue podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and give the podcast a rating and review to help others find us. Vegalogue is produced by AUSVEG, the peak industry body for Australian vegetable, potato and onion growers. You can find more news and information from AUSVEG at ausveg.com.au, on our social media channels or in the Australian Grower magazine. Thank you for listening.